Appreciate people joining us for the Findlay-Hancock County PA seminar this year. We're in a slightly different format, aren't we? So usually we get together, we hang out for a couple hours, have a little fun, and with the way that COVID in 2019 or 2020 has been this year, here we are. So thanks for hanging here with us today as we try to give it a new virtual look to our annual PA seminar. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention to everyone, we've got a great presentation lined up, but for those of you who are looking for continuing education, we have a few protocols for you. So just to adhere for this virtual presentation, in order to get credit for attending, you must be logged into Zoom for the entire presentation. And there are going to be 3 random codes that will be given out during the presentation. Please write these down. Then after it's all over, you'll receive an email where you can submit those codes. Once you have them, once you correctly input the codes, your CE credits will be processed. So I'm going to give everyone a sec here. Make sure you have a piece of paper and a pencil so that you have all those codes available to you. And because we want to make sure that you get credit for sitting here on this presentation. Now, during the presentation, if you have any questions, what we're going to ask you to do is to put them in the chat box. So we'll be watching the chat box throughout the presentation. Jamie also, I know we'll take a few breaks here or there to answer any questions that people have, but let's try to put it all in the chat box. And at the end, you also have time to ask questions of Jamie for the presentation. So with that, since I've referenced the speaker a few times now, why don't I tell you who Jamie is? So he sent me this really nice bio. So Jamie Hopkins is the Managing Director of Carson Coaching and the Director of Retirement Research at Carson Group. He is also a finance professor of practice at Creighton University's Hyder College of Business. Jamie wrote the book, Rewirement, Rewiring the Way You Think About Retirement. And he's a regular contributor to Forbes, Investment News, and prior to joining the Carson Group, he co-created the Retirement Income Certified Professional Designation Program at the American College of Financial Services. Jamie has been selected by Investment News as a top financial service professional under the age of 40 and the American Bar Association as a top 40 lawyer under 40. Jamie also hosts the Framework podcast. And with that, I will kick it over to Jamie Hopkins for today's presentation.
Thanks, Nick, and I appreciate it. I will get my slides up here back in a second, so bear with me as I pulled them up and they weren't populating right, so I'm going to do that again here in a second. But yeah, a couple things as Nick kind of brought up. I will have a lot to cover today. It's my presentation style, for any of you who have seen me before, is kind of fast and furious. All right, so they are showing right now, so I will share again. Let's do it again, run it again. So here we go. Hopefully that shows up now. Thumbs up, I see Judy's iPad there, good. Everyone see it? Little head nod. I guess, yeah. All right. So thanks, everyone. Yeah, this is, I've had the opportunity to come on and talk to you just about really where retirement income planning and retirement planning is for this year. And that's what I spend my time doing. I've been kind of in this side of the profession on retirement planning for about 13 years, focusing on income planning, background attorney, a bunch of other things, CFP professional, but this is my area of love or my passion in the professional world. So you'll see that come through here today. The other thing is, this is CE, so I will read those 3 codes out as we go. So I'll try to make sure I pause enough for that. If you have questions, write them in the chat box. And if, I try to pause, I go fast and furious. I always have a lot of slides, more slides than I need. And we'll send these slides out to you too, so you can have a copy of them. And, hopefully we have a fun time. Hopefully there's 3 or 4 things that maybe you haven't seen, and learn something today. I mean, that's usually the goal in any of these. We have very intelligent, very well-versed people here. So I'll try to give you a couple things maybe you haven't thought about exactly in that way before. So one of the things I always start off talking about, we'll talk about just trends, like what is going on in this crazy world here today, and things are just a lot different, right? I had 7 webinars last week, and I have 6 this week, which is probably as many as I ever had in a 2-week span before, and that's very different than my life was a year ago, where I was supposed to be out seeing every one of you, being in a room with Nick and Jessica, and shaking hands with people, and I'm home here with I've got husband, and then my wife's upstairs, and I've got kids, father too, and I've got 3 young kids. So I usually say they can make an appearance, and my dog's not in here right now, so he sometimes makes an appearance too. And then we'll go into like what are some of the income and charitable strategies that have changed. So first part here, right? I don't need to tell people that there's been a pandemic going on, right? Like you're aware of that. But we have had, a different time in the market. And I like kind of thinking about this stuff. If you're playing bingo, right? You get the unprecedented, right? We saw a crazy market earlier this year, something that we've never seen before, right? It was the fastest, down, bear, and back up we've ever seen, right? And by a large margin, right? I mean, I think, the speed that the market went down and the speed it recovered, we've never seen before. We also saw through August, and I thought this number was amazing, so I've kept it on some of my slides for a while, which is we saw 74 daily market swings in the S&P 500 of at least 1%. That is a lot through August, right? We had an incredibly volatile market, which has smoothed out a little bit right now. I mean, we're the last couple of days, right? Last week or two, we've had a little bit of a downturn again, but some of the volatility has gotten a little bit flatter, and then the market's done okay. It's been slightly up for the year again. And, but this is moving, right? We're definitely not done with this. So I think one of the key takeaways here is like, don't think that everything's just all the way back to normal. There's still a lot of uncertainty out there, which is driving a lot of what is occurring out there in the world from a tax perspective, from a planning, from a market. And so then you kind of shifting back a little bit, Leo, what are some of the macro issues that we're starting to get worried about? I was on a great call yesterday with a lot of fixed income experts, and some of these things came up, which is, what about tax revenue? Where are we going next with tax revenue, right? We've solved basically the largest spending bill we've ever seen from a government perspective to really, kind of normalize some of the markets and provide a lot of unemployment, provide healthcare benefits, right, in the CARES Act. But it's a lot of spending, right? It's essentially a $6 trillion spending plan through the Fed and the government. So this long-term tax revenue item is definitely out there, right? Where are we going to see volatility and unemployment risk? And the unemployment, right, we've had some of a recovery, but I think we're still sitting at roughly 30 million Americans that are unemployed right now. Like that's a risk. It leads to a risk of things in Social Security on funding status, which we were hearing more and more about. Early retirement, right? Definitely a risk for those that are unemployed close to retirement. I mean, that's a new thing here for many people who thought they had a really good plan in place, and maybe they end up retiring a little bit earlier. We also see, right, the low interest rate environment. This was the calls on yesterday, and just where are people going to chase yield? Are they going to take more risks to get higher returns? Is probably a lot of the advisors and attorneys and CPAs in here remember the days of, right, hey, we want bond portfolios that are doing 5-6%, and that's pretty good. And then it was 4%, then it was 3%, and today, right, the short term is essentially zero. And Fed came out and said, hey, expect that to stay at zero for a couple of years. We're seeing more developed countries use negative rates, right, which is an interesting phenomena that's changing some of the ways we look at things. But you've got countries, China, the second largest bond market out there, right, still at 3%. Type yield, which, are we going to see more diversification? They're about a quarter of the size of the U.S. bond market, but only about 3% of investing comes from international in the Chinese bond market. So it's a very interesting thing. Now, these are just a lot of pieces, right? They're big macro issues that we're talking about. And then we kind of move into, well, what's some of the legislation that's going on? Everyone's probably very familiar with the first two, and I'll dive into some of the planning around these as we go. The CARES Act, right, that was passed in March this year. wrapped into that 6 trillion in spending. The Secure Act, which passed the end of last year, which I thought, right, going into, you go back in time, 2019, right, we were all like, hey, we're going to spend this whole year from a planning standpoint looking at Secure Act opportunities. Right, you fast forward 10 months and right, hey, everything's different, right? We didn't spend nearly as much time on that as I would have hoped to. I thought I was just going to be spending the whole year just, working away at that and helping advisors and attorneys fine tune some of their planning around it. And, the world changed. Now, what's coming next? I think, we saw House and, the president this past week say, hey, we're kind of close to a deal now. So we might see that next stimulus bill here within, and I don't know if it's always best to call these stimulus bills or, liquidity bills or, whatever you want to call them, but what's coming next. And we'll have something it looks like now here pretty soon, even though we've been saying that, you've been hearing people say that since end of July. So the next part here I want to go to is just, where do you come in as an advisor, as a, and I know the group is more than just financial advisors here. So what is the value that you provide? Well, where are a lot of people today? A lot of people are this, right? They're concerned. They're worried about the volatility, the economy, health concerns, longevity, running out of money, right? They're worried about all these different things. And to a large extent, what an advisor is out there to do is just to put people, right, feeling in a better place about their own finances and future. And when you actually look at research around this and the true value of an advisor, what you see tends to be the more planning that a professional engages in with a client, the more secure they become about their own future. So it becomes fairly simple that I always say is you lead with plan, right? Start with how do we just get our clients into a better place? How do they feel more secure? How can we create a process and a system, right? That yes, we're going to run into road bumps and we're going to overcome hurdles and there's going to be wind, but we keep them moving in a direction that they feel comfortable with. Now, the next part here, what I do is I kind of frame up my thoughts around income planning. And so this is a little bit for many of you kind of, it might be rudimentary, but also for CE purposes, it's, we've got to keep on some of these topics. But that I love retirement income planning. It's why I joined this profession. It completely spoke to me because it is essentially, right, when we look out at, for most Americans, what is their ultimate goal for finances? It's essentially to get through retirement, not run out of money, allow them to do the things that they want to do. And everyone wants to do different things, right? Like I have different desires than probably some of the people in the room. And, when I'm out in rooms with people, I love to like talk about this more. Like, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? And so the way I describe it is retirement income planning is like trying to hit a moving target in the wind. And so what is the target? The target are your individual goals, your clients' goals, right? And they're unique. We often see, right, between spouses, different goals. Everyone in this room probably has slightly different goals. And so that's unique. That's your target. And we're trying to hit that target. We're trying to accomplish that. And I always say it's moving. Well, why is it moving for retirement income planning? Because we don't know how long anyone's going to be in retirement, right? If I knew you were going to be in retirement 17 years, 3 months, and 2 days, could we come up with a pretty good income plan? Of course we could. We've got a level of certainty. But instead, we're creating income for an uncertain period of time from a volatile asset. If you're, talking about your investments, that's very challenging. And the other thing I say is there's wind. Why is there wind? Because things are going to change along the way. We've got to make adjustments. One of the great quotes around this, and I didn't develop this, but it was in a Kiplinger article this last year, was, we can't control the way that the wind blows, right? But if we're sailing, right, what we can do is change the direction of our sails, because we can either let the wind blow us off course into the rocks, or we can move our sails so the wind helps us take us to where we want to go. And that's really what planning is about. It's about having a process and a system, taking all those things, putting it together, right? Your goals, your income needs, taking the risks that you might face along the way, and then creating that plan. And it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to change over time. The next thing here is I like to frame up what are some of the philosophies out there on income planning, and what different philosophies might we learn from, and which ones might we use well. And something's beeping out there. But we have three that I like to talk about. And so safety first, systematic withdrawal, or bucketing. And so a safety first or flooring approach really takes this mindset that it says, what are your goals? What are your spending needs? What's essential to your lifestyle? Your housing, your taxes, your food, right? Those things are essential needs. We can't really have a retirement without meeting those expenditures. So let's go out and make sure that we have secure income sources, right, that can help meet those essential expenses. And it really is this idea of building a floor of income that you can't outlive. So Social Security provides a floor for most Americans, right? About 94% of working class Americans today pay into the Social Security system. For 2/3 of Americans, it's more than half of their retirement income. So it is a huge part of what we do, but you can get CD ladders and tips and bonds, right? Pensions, income annuities to help build in that floor of income. Rental property, right? If you believe it won't go down. Obviously, there's some challenges with that being, what level of security does it bring? But it is a potential income source. Versus a bucketing approach to income planning. A bucketing approach, it doesn't always mean you're going to have different allocations, but it is a different way to present it. What I typically think about a bucketing approach is it's a storytelling approach, right? Like, why do you have the assets that you have for retirement? Why do you have CDs and bonds? Why do you have mixed portfolios? Why do you still have equities in retirement? And what it tells you is that we're going to use assets at different time periods, right? So I'm going to use my CDs and my cash this year and next year in the short term. Why? Well, because those are very safe. And I know that I need income in the next couple of years. It's less likely I need income in 10 years. And it's even less likely that I need income in 30 years. So I'm actually willing to take more risk with those assets based on my need from a time diversification standpoint. So there is a lot that people like about this. We also tend to use, from a behavioral finance technique, right, mental accounting. We like to segment things out on our spending. Like, everyone probably has like some bank account that they use for one particular purpose. You might have a credit card that you use for one particular purpose. This is the idea of mental accounting, that we like to tie spending needs to assets naturally. So there is a benefit from a behavioral standpoint of explaining your income in retirement through a time segmentation or bucketing approach. Then lastly, I like to talk about systematic withdrawal. Systematic withdrawal would be more of what you see when you log into almost all financial, whether you're looking at custodians or investments, you'll see some type of portfolio breakdown like on the screen, some percentage in each one. And so the traditional advisor did some type of liquidation of that total portfolio to meet spending goals. And that's the 4% rule that everyone here has probably at least heard before. Bill Bengen's research back in the 1990s, right? 50% large cap US, 50% US bonds, right? Spend 4% adjusted for inflation over 30 years, don't run out of money, right? And that's a type of systematic withdrawal. And obviously we can have variations of that, but it's the best example of it as a well-known example. So one of the things then is, so we have all of these philosophies. We have this need to, for most people, just to not run out of money in retirement. So we try to put these plans together. And then, as I said, they're going to be moving. And the moving is the longevity piece. And so I just hit a couple numbers on this. But what we see from research is many people underestimate their own life expectancy, which means they're not actually shooting as far out as they should be to hit their target. That they're probably going to need more income than they're expecting because they don't expect to live long enough, which means that people make inefficient decisions around Social Security claiming, which, there's a million and one articles saying defer Social Security, right? There's a million articles in an insurance agent saying buy lifetime income. And a lot of this is based on the fact that, again, people don't kind of value the longevity as much as they should. Now, I often put longevity in here as a risk, and I am trying to get better on this. And I've actually somewhat convinced myself that longevity shouldn't be listed as a risk anymore, but a risk exacerbator, right? Like, it's not a risk to live a long time. Like, I think everyone would like that, right? Like, it's not a bad thing to live a long time. It's actually a really good thing. So longevity in of itself is not a risk. It's a great thing, right? I do want to live a long time. It's a risk exacerbator because the risk that we run into, the risk of running out of money, inflation risk, right? Long-term care, healthcare costs, those risks become exacerbated the longer we live. So it is really better to be viewed as a risk exacerbator. What are the risks that actually get exacerbated the longer we live? Now, one of the things you can pull out a bunch of different stats, average life expectancies, and how many people live later and later. And I think two of the more interesting pieces are if you have a couple alive at 65, right? It's more likely than not that at least one of them will live past age 90. And if you're saying, well, it's more than a 50% chance that's going to occur, you should be planning for it. But we still have many people that don't plan to live to age 90. Now, even when you get to 90, I thought this was a really interesting stat I pulled up the other day. And you can honestly make an argument that it's longer than this now. Social Security's life expectancies tend to not be fully up to date. They were done a while ago. But if you're alive at 90, what's your average expected life expectancy remaining at 90? And this was higher than I thought it was going to be when I pulled it up. And so it's still over 4 years for both a male and a female alive at age 90, right? Like, that's a really interesting thing because, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm not going to live to 95. Well, it all depends on what age you get to, right? Like, once you're at 65, there's a decent chance you're going to be alive at 95. Once you're alive at 90, it's actually almost more likely than not that you're going to be alive at 94, right? So all of a sudden, right, we have to kind of review this, that the longevity as we age, like, it's a little bit more likely that we're going to live another year because we didn't die last year. And that's not something most people factor in. I tell a little story here about my great-grandmother. When and it was right around age 100. I probably get the exact age wrong. But I think it was right around when she turned 100 or 102. She lived to 103. And she called up my grandfather and she goes, Pat, my grandfather, he goes, where am I with my finances? She really was never involved, right? Her husband had dealt with them, and then my grandfather stepped in for a lot of it. And she goes, where are my finances? Like, I want to know that I'm okay. And he goes, Mom, don't worry about it. Dad left you plenty of money. You guys were fine. You're in a home. But we've got enough money to live to 115. You'd be totally fine. And she goes, well, what the hell am I going to do after that? And I was like, I love that, right? It's one of my favorite stories. And, here she is, right? And if you probably told most people you're going to live to 115, but when you're at 102, all of a sudden, right, you are still caring about the next 5 years, right? And, who knows how long she would have lived. She actually went up and tried to change a light bulb by herself in her thing and fell and broke her hip, and then everything deteriorated. But she still lived a couple years, right, after she asked that question. And I think that's a really good way to think about things. And I like that story. So now let's shift, right? There's this longevity piece, and we just have to deal with that, right? We've got to consider the client, and their needs, their family history, things like that, and try to put the best plan together we can with them, but hopefully explaining longevity. Then the next part here is the wind. And this is going to get in more to now back to 2020. What are we doing from a planning side? And so I start with kind of an overview of our two main, legislative changes here in the past year, right? It's really not even a year now. It's 10 months. But the Secure Act and the CARES Act. So the Secure Act, right, is a really big, retirement bill. It's the biggest changes in retirement planning going back to the Pension Protection Act almost 15 years ago. So we really didn't have major retirement changes for 15 years. Then we got this bill, and we have 29 separate provisions inside of the Secure Act. And we're not going to spend time on all 29. It's almost impossible to cover all 29 in a presentation. I've done it, but it is a lot. A lot of those aren't all that important from a planning perspective. There's a lot of qualified plan provisions and reporting provisions and funding provisions. But if you take a step back from the bill, there's a couple main takeaways. So the first one is there were kind of three main goals. If you look at the actual provisions, what are they impacting? Well, one of the takeaways was there was a step to encourage more small employers to set up retirement plans. Number two, there was definitely a goal here. And if you look at the lobbyists, it's clear, right? It's always a good way to understand where a bill is coming from. But who are the lobbyists? The lobbyists here for this bill were the life insurance world, right? The insurance world. And they were very much pushing on this, that there was a lot of provisions in here about increasing lifetime income, easing the ability of getting annuities into 401ks, better rollover distribution rules for annuities. So a lot of kind of changes around that. And then step three, there was a lot of what I would say is distribution changes. I have RMD up there, but it really is just distribution changes. And one of the things you look around that, part three, well, why did they change these distributions? They changed these distributions because, ding, 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 they were trying to generate tax revenue. It was one of the first things I had in here. Tax revenue. Now, I should probably pause here. Let's say I'm about 22 minutes in, and we'll do the first code. It's a good time for that. So if you want CE, please write down the code 755, and I'll say it again. Code is 755. So one more time, code 755. Good. All right. So we'll continue on there. One last time, code is 755. We'll do two more codes. So we've got this tax revenue generating bill, and that's a really interesting thing, right? We hear a bill that's passed called the Secure Act, setting every community up for retirement enhancement. Well, that sounds wonderful, right? Your congressman comes out and says, setting every community up for retirement enhancement. That's what I passed. I did a great job for you. And then when you look at the core rate, it was raising tax revenue. Well, how did it raise tax revenue? Most of the tax revenue came from one single provision. Provision 3 right here, the stretch IRA rules, right? Taking away the ability for many beneficiaries to stretch distributions from inherited retirement accounts over the course of their life and condensing those to a 10-year time period. Now, you can argue whether or not that's a good thing from a public policy standpoint, but the reality is it's a change, right? And I'm not here to argue the plus minus of a public policy change. I'm here to tell you, hey, here are the rules. Now we got to deal with them. So we have new rules. We have wind. Our course that we were on before has now been shifted. Now we need to shift our sails. There's some other positive changes in here that I view as positive, right? That are on the flip side. You can now continue to save in an IRA after age 70 and a half if you're working and deduct the contributions. That's a nice change, right? That was a silly rule to begin with. RMD, remove that back from age 70 and a half to 72 for those who had not yet obtained age 70 and a half by the end of 2019. Meaning moving forward, right, RMDs start the year in which you hit age 72. Well, I think that's nice. It pushes it back a little bit. It doesn't have a huge impact, honestly, on portfolio sustainability, but it is just a better thing. I mean, I think the whole idea of 70 and a half is a little bit confusing to people. So 72 is a nice round number. There's some benefit to that. Now, I also want to just hit this one, right? CARES Act, part of the $6 trillion. I shouldn't say it's all there, but part of the $6 trillion in spending in 2020 in reaction to the coronavirus COVID-19, this relief effort, right? We saw this all kinds of things, right? We saw the small business loans, pension protection, the PPP loans, Paycheck Protection Program loans. We saw state level loans. We saw unemployment, and we did see a bunch of retirement changes in here, but really three that are meaningful from a planning standpoint. Probably the biggest one is RMDs were suspended for 2020. I had been speaking about this a lot more because there was some opportunity through the end of August to roll those back, and that's mostly gone at this point. So now we're really just to the 60-day rollover cycle again. We could see some legislative change on that, but otherwise, right, that's a really powerful thing for a lot of people. And we still have to be on the lookout for opportunities there. Many clients, right, take their RMDs at the end of the year in December. So they need to be put on notice that you might not need to take it in December. Now, if you need the income, you take it out because you're not taking it because of required distributions, you're taking it because of spending needs. But if they are taking distributions because of the RMD, it's at least something to look at. Should we be doing Roth conversions? Should we be doing QCDs and donating to charity? Should we just suspend those distributions into next year? Those are all things that we need to be looking at. Probably the one area that I see people missing on that is that inherited accounts, that's true for them too. So inherited IRAs, inherited 401ks, the required minimum distributions have been suspended for 2020. So a lot of people are missing that and still taking them out. CRD, we might hit, I have it in here, coronavirus-related distribution exception. I'm not going to talk much about the expanded 401k loan options. That provision's almost up at this point here too. So what I want to spend a little bit of time on here now is talking about how do we maybe change our plans to address some of that wind that occurred with the removal of the stretch provisions for many inherited retirement accounts, right? So that's one of the biggest things out there. So how are we accounting for that? So with the 10-year planning, part of it's let's just take a step back and understand where the rules were and where they're going. So prior to the passage of the Secure Act, right? Most times when we left our IRAs, our 401ks to our children or grandchildren, right, our friends, they could take distributions, right, essentially over the course of their life. So it was a fixed life expectancy when they inherited the account and it drops by 1 each year, but it essentially spread out distributions over a long period of time, which allowed for the accounts to still get a lot of the tax deferral or, in a Roth case, tax-free growth. And it managed to spread out the distributions over a small period of time. So not typically raising our taxable income significantly year to year. Now, the change here, when we condense this time period to a 10-year time period, what happens? Well, we get increased taxes or, better tax revenue for the government. And it's occurring because of two main pieces. Number one is we have a shorter period now of tax advantages to this money. So we've taken away some tax advantages. Part two is, well, just because we've removed tax advantages, should that really be saying increased taxes? Well, when you remove tax benefits, right, it has to be invested somewhere else, which will typically be taxable. So that is, or it will be spent and go into the cycle there. The other side, though, is that by condensing the distributions across a shorter period of time, right, we move people up into higher tax rates. That's really where the majority of this tax revenue will actually come from. So I'll show an example of that here in a second too. Now, this is, as I said, we had different rules prior to this year. So we used to do planning around a different set of rules. Now, these rules now apply starting in 2020 for anyone who dies. So what we have to look at is there's a handful of issues that can be created. And I'm mostly going to hit on the pass-through or see-through trusts or conduit trusts. And one of the biggest issues I've seen out there this year, which to me still is not getting the attention that it needs to get. Now, there are some exceptions to the 10-year rule. And the exceptions, the main ones are, I'm just going to, well, we can read through this. It's on the screen. But the starting point now is, hey, it's 10 years. That's the starting point unless we have an exception. If we have an exception, it's going to be, right, main two is, right, spouse of the deceased owner, right? They'll still be able to stretch. Okay, that makes sense because we don't want to necessarily force a surviving spouse to deplete all their retirement accounts within a 10-year period. So it makes sense to give them a stretch. We're kind of treating that as a singular unit for income purposes. Makes sense. The other one here is minor children of the deceased owner. Now, there's a lot. I have an asterisk next to that. It's really until they reach the age of majority and then 10 years. So the interesting thing about that is if you leave it to your, 16-year-old kid and they turn 18, they go into the workforce, they don't continue to college, right? And they're 18 in that state, all of a sudden they have 10 years from the point that they reach the age of majority. So it might only be 12 years. It's not a true stretch. It's a stretch till the age of majority and then 10 years. So even in best case, it's going to be to 24 with some schools, some abilities to stay in school, and then 10 years. So we still are vastly shorter than we ever were before. And remember right there, it says minor children. It does not apply to grandchildren. So grandparent leaves the IRA to grandchild. Grandchild is 10 years old. They have to distribute the entire account within 10 years. I would say in some of those cases, that's a little bit of a disaster. It's not a great outcome. So those are some of our main exceptions. There are other chronically ill, disability from the federal one, certain types of trusts, if they're spousal trusts, could qualify too as stretch. Now, I have a much further and detailed example of this, and if anyone wants to go through some of the math on all the way through and walk through the taxes, I'm happy to share that deck or example or analysis. So you have a calculator that does this too. But this is just, I just left this piece in here at this point to kind of highlight this. So this would be 75-year-old passing away, leaving their IRA to their 45-year-old child. And I just use $1 million, right? I mean, it's an example. So $1 million is a nice, easy number with an extra zero. It actually looks like on there, but leave $1 million. And the old rules would be 38.8 years. We get to divide it by that and essentially $25,000 a year under the old rules distributed a year. Now, if we levelize this, it's not what's required, but if we tried to spread it out over 10 years, it'd be $100,000 a year. Now, what happens to an individual's tax rates if you add $100,000 of taxable income onto it? I see Titus Allen. Where do you think your taxes go if you add $100,000 onto your taxable income? Yeah, it goes up. Pretty much if you're in any tax bracket at this point, if you add $100,000 on, unless you're already in the top bracket, you're going to subject some of that money to a higher tax rate. Right? Like that's just what happens. The ranges don't typically, handle an extra $100,000. Can you have $25,000 in a range and not go to the next tax rate? Yeah, you can, depending on where you sit in it, but not really with 100. So this is and this is a fairly straightforward example, right? A lot of people fall into this. Now think about this too. Here's the real kicker on this, and where I think there's a lot of planning opportunity. 75-year-old, or you could even move them 10 years later if you want and say 85. Doesn't really matter. But 85-year-old passing away, leaving $1 million to a 55-year-old kid, right? Where do you think a 45 to 55-year-old is in their work career? Right? Pause and think about that for a second. Where are they in their work career? Are they in probably the highest earning years of their life? Yeah. Who's inheriting retirement accounts? Right? Yeah. Kids of parents that are 30 years younger than them, 25 years younger than them. So 85-year-olds, right? Average life expectancy, leaving it to 55-year-olds in their highest earning years. Well, when you start looking at that, what just happened? We just shifted taxes, right? From really occurring at a retiree at their lowest earning years down to the highest earning years. And under the old rules, at least I would get to spread them out over 38 years. So when I was 45, I could spread half of those out to when? To when I was retired and pay really low taxes on them again. And now we have it. We've shifted this to essentially encapsulate the highest earning years of a worker's career and subject these to taxes. Right. So there's a really strong argument when you start putting all this together, right, is tax diversification, Roth conversions, looking at the income and tax rates of both the person who owns the account and their beneficiaries. It completely changes the planning, honestly, from a wealth transfer standpoint than the old rules. The old rules were very favorable. Now, I have to then take a step back. I did say here, right, that if we levelized. Now, this is really, really important for the next slide. And this next slide is my single biggest takeaway here in the whole thing. So if you learn one thing today and pay attention to one thing, it would be this. So let's take a step back and say, how is the Secure Act rule around this really written? The Secure Act rule essentially says, right, pass away, the beneficiary must distribute the full account by the end of the 10th year following the year of death, right? So somebody dies this year, then starting next year, they've got 10 years. So by the end of, if you died in 2020, by the end of 2030, the full IRA must be distributed out. So the interesting thing about that is it did add on a benefit. The benefit is you have flexibility to determine how much money you want to take out each year. You could take 20% out year one, 25% the next year, then wait for the rest of the 55% into the 10th year and take it out. So we did get kind of full flexibility across that 10-year period on when to take distributions. We just have to distribute the whole account by the end of the 10th year. Now, where this creates, right, where that is generally speaking a good thing, right? It gave us flexibility. Where this created to some degree probably a side effect problem is when it came to the drafting of Secure Act trusts. And I am sure that this is continuing on in post-Secure Act trusts because attorneys, I'm an attorney, and I did estate planning. We tend to use forms. And a lot of the forms, if you're using the same form you did last year because you thought it was a pretty good form, the clause is still in there. And you see that often. These need to be updated. So if you go look at a lot of the pass-through trusts, this is very common planning. You go in, you say, hey, we're going to use this trust. It's going to get the IRA assets. It'll qualify for the stretch. The way we're going to design it is with this clause. It says beneficiary, right, will have access to the RMDs each year. We're going to, essentially either set up separate accounts or use the oldest beneficiary's age to determine the distribution period. Very common, right? So trust use for beneficiary planning existed for IRAs. Lots of these are set up. The challenge is, if you go read some of these clauses, and I've worked on probably over 50 of them this year, a lot of them have language that either is not ideal or truly problematic. This is more so the worst case that I have up here. And I'll tell you kind of about one that might just be problematic, but not worst case, which is beneficiaries will only have access to the RMDs of the IRA or 401k each year. Okay. That worked really well when we were trying to stretch out distributions, okay? What happens now? What happens now when we apply that trust language to the new required minimum distributions of the Secure Act? Well, we read the trust language. We say beneficiary has access to the RMD each year. Okay, so I go to calculate RMD for year one after death. What is it? Got $1 million. Must all be distributed by the 10th year. My RMD for year one is ding, 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 $0. My RMD year two is ding, 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 $0. Year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the required distribution in those years after the year of death is $0. So if my trust access language gives me access to the RMD for years 1 through 9, guess what I have access to? $0. Now, will they eventually get access to the money? Sure, in the 10th year, because the full amount must be distributed by the end of the 10th year. I now have access to 100% of that $1 million in the 10th year, meaning that my 55-year-old in my last example, because it's 10 years later now, probably still in the highest earning years of their life, is going to have $1 million of taxable income from this IRA and no access for the previous 9 years. Is that the desire of most clients? No. What's going to happen? And Titus, I called on you before. You're just showing up on my screen, right? So, right, what happens when we have $1 million of taxable income in 1 year, right? 2 fingers, way up, right? We have now basically created the highest possible tax situation for this money that we ever could have, right? I mean, and also, how many people in this room? We've got 38, 39 people. How many people think in 10 years from today, tax rates are going to be higher or lower than they are today? We don't know, but I would bet you everyone in this room says it is probably more likely than not that tax rates are higher in 10 years than they are today. By law, they will be higher than 10 years today. So even if you just go with the status quo, right, Tax Cut and Job Act comes off after 2025, we'll be in higher tax rates in 2030. So, right, by law, we'll be in higher tax rates. Now, obviously, we'll see some tax changes, but that's probably not the planning your client wants. And think about how mad somebody is if you stand between them and their money. If they come in and they thought, hey, I just buried my mom. I helped pay for some of the funeral costs. Mom didn't have a whole bunch of other assets. I was settling that. There was a trust, though. Their main asset was their IRA. I'm going to get access to this. They walk into your office and you say, hey, come back in 10 years. Right? Is that going to go well? No, of course it's not going to go well. Now, what do you do to deal with this, right? Well, one is we just have to look at the trust. Some trusts are written a little bit better. They give more access, but some don't. I saw another one this year. I was on the phone with the attorney, and he goes, yeah, we have that, but we also have, And he reads it out and he goes, we have this other clause that says an additional access is otherwise stated in the trust document. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty good. Where else in the trust document does it say they have access points to the IRA? And we sat like that for like 6 seconds where it was completely silent. He says, yeah, I'm not really sure we do. And so they went and just added some additional things. I had one where they had that almost that exact same clause up there, and they had a health education and HEMS clause, right? Health education maintenance support clause attached to it, which to me, that's actually one of my recommendations is I think there's an easy fix to this. If you had similar language to this, but you want to give more access, add a HEMS clause, add a 5 and 5 clause. Why? Because we already have those. We don't have to redraw them up. Every attorney has those. We all have them and they work. So you don't have to get too creative. And if I add a health education maintenance support, a 10-year, distribution clause, and a 5%, that's a pretty good distribution, actually. I'll be able to levelize pretty well there and still keep some of the tax benefits. So to me, that's a simple solution. But they had the health education maintenance support, nothing else. So that was probably the only access point to year 10. And the person, it was a fairly large IRA. We're talking about a little over 10 million in qualified assets that have been rolled over. And he goes, well, what if my daughter wants to take $30,000 out and go on a vacation? And I said, does your daughter go on $30,000 vacations today? He goes, of course not. She doesn't have any money. And I was like, then she can't go on a $30,000 vacation from a HEMS clause, right? Like there's a lot of flexibility in that, but it's about kind of your current standard. So that wouldn't solve that issue either. And so we ended up, right, redrafting that one to add a little bit more flexibility. So this one is a big deal. So what I have been continuously warning people about this one is I wish it was a little bit worse in the fact that I could go out and say all of the trusts are a problem. Right? Like we're almost better off when we get a rule change and it actually just says like, hey, everything's a problem. I don't know if your client's trusts are a problem. Some of them are, and some of them are fine, but it does require us based on this change to go review all of those, right? We have to do this for our clients, right? And regardless of where you are, right? If you're the CPA, right? Bringing this up as a tax thing to consider. If you're doing tax planning, if you're an advisor, definitely looking at the right way to transfer the wealth. If you're an attorney and you're doing active planning, making sure that your documents are up to date, right? I think there's some liability risk there if you continue to add this and don't discuss the potential issue with this. There are times when this might be a good thing. Maybe you are trying to lock up the money. Okay, you can do that. I think on the flip side, Roth IRAs seem very beneficial in this. If I had the opportunity to sit the Roth IRA for 10 years, no distributions, and let it grow the whole time, that's actually a nice feature. It's, from a wealth, accumulation standpoint, the Roth works pretty well here. So that's, essentially just a challenge with that. Now I will, as we're going to a new new section here, we will pause again and do the second code, which is 900. So next code for CE purposes is 900. One more time. Second code is 900. So the next part here I want to talk about is, and I've got a lot of these, and I'm kind of scrolling through my deck at the bottom. This deck is 68 slides long, and we're not going to hit all of them. And that's the great thing. PowerPoint allows me, right, especially when I present a computer, to jump around where I want to go. And the thing here is there's a lot of planning strategies out there now to consider. And again, it goes back to the goals, though. Like this is the whole thing. I can't tell you whether this is right or wrong, whether, you have to do this, whether you should do this. I can give you examples of things and they fit different clients, right? And that's really where we are here. There's a lot of planning strategies to consider now because, again, the course we were on was shifted. The rules are different. The tax consequences are different. The access points are different. So should we consider different planning strategies depending on the client's goals, right? So spousal rollovers, I think, is a great one because I find this one really interesting. I would say primarily in the past, right? The idea of before the Secure Act, probably the best thing to do from accumulation and tax perspective was leave your retirement assets to your surviving spouse. They get to stretch the assets over their life, and then they get to leave it again to somebody else who also gets to stretch. That was a very positive from a public policy and tax perspective. Now, fast forward to today, there's a lot of cases where that's still going to be the case. Surviving spouse needs the income. I have husband and wife up here. I usually kill off husbands first in my scenario. So when people are like, hey, you don't mix them up too much. Well, I'm killing off the husbands first. So it seems fair. But husband, wife, right? Still a lot of times today, we're going to leave assets to surviving spouse and they're going to need the income. They're trying to get through retirement. But when we start thinking about how do we maximize wealth transfer, it's not clear that we always want to leave the assets to the surviving spouse. There's a very unique scenario, or I shouldn't say unique, but interesting scenario where maybe the surviving spouse has enough income. And maybe we want to consider splitting up the assets. So you see, after the Secure Act, we could have this situation where it's actually beneficial to send maybe some assets to a surviving spouse, but send the IRA or a portion of the IRA to the surviving children, the daughter in this example. Why? It would create, I've got another one that has a nicer timeline on this, but essentially would create a timeline starting at the death of the first spouse, the husband, for 10 years for the daughter. Meaning maybe they're only adding $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 of taxable income onto their current tax base, meaning we're minimizing those taxes. If we left it to the wife and she was taking all of the RMDs in her life, she would be adding the full amount on. Maybe that's not a great scenario. And then when the spouse dies, the surviving spouse, they also leave their own retirement assets to the daughter, triggering a new 10-year period. So maybe we can stretch out the distributions over a longer period of time and actually keep the required distributions a little bit lower to minimize the tax implications. Now, it's a little bit complex, but it's a cool thing to think about, right? Like that is a different planning scenario than we saw traditionally than in the past, because we've got these condensed time windows. And in essence, it's a way to spread out the distribution window, right, over multiple people, over multiple different tax brackets. So just kind of an interesting way to look at things. I've mentioned Roth, but I'm going to hop over one of my probably the more interesting ones is, and especially because we are here today, right, with the Community Foundation, and thank you for inviting everyone. So it's good to start talking about charitable giving. And charitable remainder trusts have been one of the bigger charitable remainder trusts and donor advised funds. Both of these have gotten a huge boost from, especially from the retirement asset and planning since going back to Tax Cut and Job Act at the end of 2017. So let's talk about using perhaps a charitable remainder trust with a retirement account. Now, I'm going to use the visual here. It's very simple. I think hopefully most people have some baseline understanding of charitable remainder trust here, and I'm making it as simple as possible. So we designate the charitable remainder trust as the beneficiary of the IRA. We pass away. IRA now goes to the trust, gets distributed in there. No taxes are paid because of the charitable classification. Assets get to grow essentially tax advantage. Lifetime income or payments for a term are distributed out to a beneficiary. Here I have the children because it's a retirement account. It's most likely our designated beneficiary here. And then the remainder, right, at the end of the trust or the term would be distributed to the charity. Right? So that's essentially the setup here. Now, the question becomes, right, is this valuable now in post-stretch era, right? And so this is actually an example. This particular example was run by Bob Keebler, it's a pretty good example, and he ran it a little while ago for multiple different scenarios, so I've continued to use this one. But essentially, very simple, basic setup. 50-year-old inheriting the account, right? So maybe an 80-year-old passing away, leaving it to their 50-year-old, $1 million of a traditional IRA, 6% growth rate, and using today's tax ranges. Then said, what are the different outcomes? Let's look across multiple different things. Let's just say we leave the IRA to the kid and they liquidate the whole thing and invest it. Let's say, right, they take it over 5 years, it's left to the estate. Let's say they could stretch it, which they can't do anymore. Let's say we use a charitable remainder trust. And let's compare that actually today, really amongst the rules that we have today.
You can come in.
I can? Someone was off mute. He said he can come in, so I appreciate it. And so what we have here, right, is what's the net to the family and the charity? I actually have another slide that shows the net to the individual. But what we start looking at is, look, the stretch IRA was really, really good, right? Like it was just a good setup. Now that's the green one right in the middle. If you look right to the right of that, we've got this kind of ocean bluish color that says 10-year rule in the color code down before. Now what you'll see is, right, for these size of assets, we lost a lot of tax benefits. We're going to accumulate less wealth. Okay, we've accepted that. That's the new rule. But if we leverage this now with a charitable remainder trust or charitable remainder unit trust, we can now pass more total wealth to both the family and the charity by leveraging these vehicles. Why? Well, to make it very simple, I've tried to just, you can go through all the math or you can explain why. And the why is essentially what we're doing is we're shifting the taxes that would otherwise be paid to this, right, essentially from the government to the charity. In a very simple standpoint, that's essentially what's occurring, right? So instead of, if you added the government on here, right, we would get, all these would be fairly equal lines, right? So all that's really occurring in here, what we're missing is, right, what does the government get? And by using the charitable remainder annuity trusts and CRUTs, we're essentially able to siphon off, right, taxes that we would otherwise be paying in higher distributions and taxable investments away from the government and to the charity. I mean, that's the best way to think about this. So the question then becomes, if you're leaving this asset to your heirs, do you want to leave a larger portion of it to the government, or would you like to shift some of that to your favorite charity? And so for larger IRAs, this becomes a very important discussion. And what I tell people today is, I don't know if that's the answer. You've still got to be charitably inclined, right? But you should probably run the numbers and see where it comes out today. Because, right, if I could tell you, right, you could leave a total wealth over the course of your kids' thing of $4 million, and the government gets whatever the other amount was, or we can leave to your kid and to the charity about $5.5 million. Which one would you rather do? And you might say, well, I do like that idea of leaving about $5.5 million. And actually, when you pull out the other one, these two are fairly comparable to the 10-year on what we can still leave to the individual. So we're not necessarily shortchanging the beneficiary by any means. And that's why I say run the numbers. It depends on what you project for growth. It depends on what you project for their tax rates to be. It does depend on the size of the IRA, because larger distributions, more money is going to government, which means there's actually more of a benefit to using CRATs and CRUTs. So when we start getting to the multiple $1 million IRAs, this becomes a very valuable strategy. So it wasn't used a ton before because, again, right, stretch IRA was really good. But now, post that, this is viable to look at whenever we're talking about larger IRA and 401k beneficiary planning. So I want to scoot over here as looking at time. Actually, it looks like there were some comments. Let's see if these are good ones to ask. You said not any of the attorneys in this webinar, all new language. Okay, that's good. Yeah. He said nobody in here better be using it, right? That's awesome.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned you have a graph that shows the amount that actually goes to the children versus the charity. Is that a slide you have right here, or?
I don't have it in this deck, but Aaron, I can, even if we take a little bit of time at the end, I could probably pull it up or send it to you real quick if you want to see it. But I do know off the top of my head that what happens there in this example is, so the CRUT will actually outperform the 10-year. It ends up with right around 4.2-ish million total. And the CRAT in this example falls a little bit below. So it's kind of, this example, the CRAT provides more to the charity, and the CRUT provides less, but the CRUT provides more to the beneficiary. But they're both very comparable to the 10-year which provided to the beneficiary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But yeah, like, so this is, and there's a couple good just tools out there. I mentioned that this one's by Keebler, so they actually have like a calculator you can run this through. It doesn't cost a whole lot to buy it. I mean, it's like $50 or something. And but if you work with a trust department, or actually if you contact, right, the community foundation, they'll probably run one of these for you and just come back with the numbers, right? Like typically that's what I tell people to do. It's not going to cost you anything. So if you've got a $2 million IRA, they're charitably inclined. run it through on what those two scenarios might give you. And you can get the breakout of here's probably, right? Again, none of it's guaranteed because it's based on assumptions, returns, but that's a really cool thing to look at because, right, as I say, when you look at this, if this was, you could block off the left side because they're not important anymore. Like, would I make that decision? And I think my answer would be yes, right? Like, I personally would rather give more money to the charity and less to the government. Right.
Or do it with 50% of your IRA. If you got a $3 million IRA, do it with 50%.
Yeah. And leave the other 1.5 directly to the kid. And they can stretch that over 10 years and then the rest over their life. Right.
Yeah. That's a really cool strategy.
Yep. Thanks for hopping in on that. So I will stick with one more charitable giving piece here to kind of wrap up. So since I'm going to skip forward, add my slide deck. You'll see I've got a bunch of other stuff in there, RMD based, and when you guys get the copy of this. Actually, what we'll do is I'll just make sure we send out the copy with the other slide in it. So I don't think we've sent that out yet. So we will get that one put in before I send it out so you can see both pieces. So the other thing here is I think I just did a video on this for somebody on Monday. And, one of the interesting things is there's a lot of opportunities with charitable giving this year. There's some changes in the rules, right? When we go out and look, we saw some minor things here, right? $300 per filing, right? That don't itemize that above the line cash deduction. Small benefit, right? But part of the changes this year, we can go to 100% of AGI this year in deductible cash gifts. Typically we're not trying to go to 100%, but we can definitely use that with like a Roth conversion strategy this year, maybe going above the normal 60%, right? So you might still not go to 100, but maybe somebody wants to do a large Roth conversion in 2020 and make a large donor advised fund contribution. So we could literally use a donor advised fund to get that full deduction, maybe 60, 70% of AGI and offset a couple $100,000, $500,000 of Roth conversions. Well, that's a very powerful strategy this year too. Because we can put both of those two things together. And now moving forward, right, we've made our large charitable. We've offset a significant amount of our taxable income because we're looking out and saying, I think tax rates are going to go up, so I better convert them now and get that out in 2020 into a tax-free growth vehicle. So that's a really cool strategy out there too. Now, the other one I love is a bunching strategy. So bunching strategy, right? Absolutely can use donor advised funds. Why is it so beneficial with donor advised fund? Because I can take $500,000, put it into a donor advised fund, right? Like with the community foundation here, right? So you could do that here, put it in, and then have that money invested, right? Which gets tax benefits, right? Inside, and then distribute it out to my charity over the next 5 years. And that's really cool because I get my deduction today for the full amount, and then I spread it over multiple years. Now, I said 500,000, but let's do one quick example of a much smaller amount. And so this is, I've just got generic name, right? Couple, and basically saying they typically give 10 grand a year. And I just drew this one up so it kind of matches the standard deduction. So they got $10,000 of SALT, $4,800 mortgage interest, and $10,000. They end up with $24,000 of itemized. They don't go over the standard deduction, which means they get no tax benefit from giving that $10,000 each of the next 3 years. So they're going to end up giving $30,000 over the next 3 years and get no tax benefit from it. So what if we just shifted that and all we did was take that 30 grand this year, put it into a donor advised fund. So we have a $30,000 itemized deduction this year. Add that on, right, to the other 14, giving us 44,800, essentially moving ourselves to actually being able to see a benefit of $20,000, right, of an itemized deduction at their rate of 35%, right, saving us 7 grand in taxes. Right? Well, that's a really good strategy. That's a lot of value we just added for essentially doing the exact same thing they wanted to accomplish, because then the donor advised fund still gives $10,000 out each year. So we still get 10 grand out each year to the charity. We still give $30,000, but we got an extra $7,000 back in taxes. Now, what could we do with that? We could spend it. We could invest it. We could give it back to charity too. I had one of these, and I did this last year with somebody, very similar conversation. And they said, well, do I really want to do that? And I said, well, if this is just more efficient, You could just give the extra, it wasn't $7,000 in that case. But I said, you could just give the extra money back to charity if we did this. And they said, oh, you know what? I like that. Right? It wasn't about the tax savings for them, but when they realized that they could just turn around and give that other $7,000 back to the charity now because they had an additional $7,000 of tax savings, they love that, right? And all that got to was this, right? For those that are charitably inclined, that have the means, that are ready to give, right? It's not necessarily convincing them to give, it's convincing them to give efficiently, right? They know they want to give. They have a plan for giving. But all we're trying to do is saying, are we giving in the most efficient ways? So that's looking at the remainder trust. It's looking at donor advised funds or just bunching into a singular year, right? And all of a sudden we are saving money in taxes. And then if the person's really charitably inclined, it doesn't have to just be a tax play. It can be a way to give more back to charity. Right. And I'm kind of going backwards in my slide, but right. Charitable giving spreads. I use the yawn. We'll see if anyone yawns now. Right. But I'm not just being cruel here, but right. Charitable giving spreads. When we talk about this, you bring family members in, you bring your kids in, right? You can then, have those really great multi-generational planning conversations, especially as we said, talking about charitable remainder trust, you get to bring the kids into the conversation. That's awesome. That's a huge value add from any type of advisor, attorney, trust officer, charitable organization standpoint. All right. I got to give you the last code here and then kind of wrap up because it looks like we're up at the hour. 321. So the last code is going to be 321, 321. So if you need CE, write the last one down. And I'll just close with a couple of my closing thoughts and then happy to have conversations, answer questions. So again, looking out, right, we absolutely know that there's going to be some tax revenue, action at some point, right? The government budget is just being pushed. We can't continue to do this forever. And honestly, even if you don't believe me, I just say, ask your clients, what do they think is going to happen to taxes in the future? We've definitely got a lot of risks we got to just pay attention to this year. Social Security, early retirement risks, inflation, which, has been low, Fed, kind of coming out with slightly different things on that, continued, right, changes, right? Like, don't expect this to be the end of the government creating rules. That's what I say. Like, we're going to get another one this year and we'll have more bills next year. So we've got a lot of opportunity out there to add value in a changing world, right? When the wind's blowing, that's when, right, the expertise of the sailor matters the most. And that's when the value of advisors, the value of attorneys, trust officers, and charitable foundations matter the most. And a lot of what we're trying to do is manage our clients' emotions. And it's okay for them to be emotional and feel things. And it's our job to help them get in that place where they feel confident and secure. So happy to answer questions or pass it back over. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Anyone have any questions? We have a few minutes here before our time is up.
You can ask questions on anything. Well, hey, that makes it easy if no one asks any questions.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Jay Edel. I'm a financial advisor at Merrill. I think that you mentioned if a minor child inherited an IRA, but they were still in school, that they could actually stretch it out further. I don't think it starts at age, you said age of majority, but it sounded like there was a clause in there that if they were still in college, maybe they could delay that tenure until they were maybe 22 or 23.
Yeah, so that's a very similar rule as to the like health insurance one right now, right? Where you can actually, they would actually be able to extend that out till age 24. And then the 10-year rule would kick in at that point, as long as they remained in school through that time period. So Natalie Schote and Ed Slott have great articles on that topic. But Jay, if you wanted something on that, I'd be happy to share it with you. But yeah, it is today. The rule is kind of age of majority, or if they're still in school all the way to 24. Do you remember, though, that like the stretch distributions kick in whenever, though? So like if they're 18, 19, 20, they still might be taking some distribution, right? But that's like, the account divided by 58 or 60, whatever that is at that age. I don't have those numbers memorized at the younger ages, but so they're still going to be taking some distribution, but not large distributions, right? So it is an interesting outcome because they might actually have to take distributions for 5-6 years. Then they could actually stop for 5 or 6 and actually wait to the 10th year to take distribution. So it's actually going to be kind of, I guess that feels very messy there, but that's a great question.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Jamie? Not hearing any. So just as, well, first and foremost, thank you, Jamie, for taking the time to do this. This was great, very informative. But to also recap real quick, to ensure your CE credit for this presentation, remember, you must have logged in the entire time, and you will receive an email with a link to submit the information for the credits. So make sure you wrote down those 3 codes. And just so that you have it one more time, code 1, 755, code 2, 900, code 3, 321. So you have all that information. When you get the follow-up email from us, please submit that so you can get your CEs. Jenna will send that email out shortly. And if you could fill that information out by the end of the day today, that would be great. You know, one of the things we just want to do real quick, I'm going to pass it off to Kathy to say a few words in closing before we end this presentation. Kathy?
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. And thank you, Jamie. That's a great presentation. Very, very useful and very relevant. I wanted to just take a minute here at the end before everybody signs off, just to say thank you. I've gotten to know so many of you over the past 12 years. And as most of you know, I'll be retiring later this year. I'll still be in Findlay. I'll still be hanging out and doing things. And hopefully we'll be crossing paths with many of you. But I just wanted to take an opportunity to say thank you. It's been a pleasure to get to know you and work with your clients as they put their legacies in action at the Community Foundation. I know that you all have gotten to know Nick over the last year and a half, and we also recently welcomed Tasha Demling to the team, and she joins Andrea Reinhardt as part of our development and donor services team as well. Because of you and all the work you've done with your donors and the support you've shown to the foundation, I have to say, the foundation is in a really great place. Our board is in the process of finding my successor, and they tell me that they're getting very close, which is lovely. So I'm looking forward to that and making that transition. But all in all, I'm just very proud of the foundation and just delighted to have worked with each of you and all the things that you have brought forward with your clients. I'm thinking about some of the individuals that we've had a chance to work with through the years, and some really great situations, and feel like we've really made a difference in their lives, and also in the lives of other people in the community who will benefit from their generosity. So thank you so much for that. Thanks again, Jamie. Great presentation. To each of you, I hope to see you out hopefully sometime having lunch, having coffee at the grocery store, doing all those things. But in the meantime, take care, stay well, and looking forward to seeing you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.